Chapter 11. Year of the War. Campaigns of Demosthenes in western Greece. Ruin of Ambracia. Summer was now over. The winter following, the plague a second time attacked the Athenians. For although it had never entirely left them, still there had been a notable abatement in its ravages. The second visit lasted no less than a year, the first having lasted 2. And nothing distressed the Athenians and reduced their power more than this. No less than 4,400 heavy infantry in the ranks died of it, and 300 cavalry, besides a number of the multitude that was never ascertained. At the same time took place the numerous earthquakes in Athens, Euboea, and Boeotia, particularly at Orchomenus in the last named country. The same winter, the Athenians in Sicily and the Rhegians, with 30 ships, made an expedition against the islands of Aeolus, it being impossible to invade them in summer, owing to the want of water. These islands are occupied by the Liparaeans, a Cnidian colony, who live in one of them of no great size called Lipara, and from this as their headquarters cultivate the rest, Didyme, Strongyle, and Hera. In Hera, the people in those parts believe that Hephaestus has his forge, from the quantity of flame which they see it send out by night, and of smoke by day. These islands lie off the coast of the Sicels and Messinese, and were allies of the Syracusans. The Athenians laid waste their land, and as the inhabitants did not submit, sailed back to Rhegium. Thus the winter ended, and with it ended the 5th year of this war, of which Thucydides was the historian. The next summer, the Peloponnesians and their allies set out to invade Attica under the command of Agis, son of Archidamus, and went as far as the Isthmus. But numerous earthquakes occurring, turned back again without the invasion taking place. About the same time that these earthquakes were so common, the sea at Orobia in Euboea, retiring from the then line of coast, returned in a huge wave and invaded a great part of the town, and retreated, leaving some of it still under water, so that what was once land is now sea, such of the inhabitants perishing as could not run up to the higher ground in time. A similar inundation also occurred at Atalanta, the island off the Opuntian Locrian coast, carrying away part of the Athenian fort and wrecking one of 2 ships which were drawn up on the beach. At Peparethus also the sea retreated a little, without however any inundation following, and an earthquake threw down part of the wall, the town hall, and a few other buildings. The cause, in my opinion, of this phenomenon must be sought in the earthquake. At the point where its shock has been the most violent, the sea is driven back, and, suddenly recoiling with redoubled force, causes the inundation. Without an earthquake, I do not see how such an accident could happen. During the same summer, different operations were carried on by the different belligerents, in Sicily, by the Siciliots themselves against each other, and by the Athenians and their allies. I shall, however, confine myself to the actions in which the Athenians took part, choosing the most important. The death of the Athenian general Charoeades, killed by the Syracusans in battle, left Laches in the sole command of the fleet, which he now directed in concert with the allies against Mylae. 2 Messinese garrisons at Mylae laid an ambush for the party landing from the ships, but were routed with great slaughter by the Athenians and their allies, who thereupon assaulted the fortification and compelled them to surrender the Acropolis and to march with them upon Messina. This town afterwards also submitted upon the approach of the Athenians and their allies, and gave hostages and all other securities required. The same summer, the Athenians sent 30 ships round Peloponnese under Demosthenes, son of Alcesthenes, and Proclus, son of Theodorus, and 60 others with 2,000 heavy infantry against Melos, under Nicias, son of Niceratus, wishing to reduce the Melians who, although islanders, refused to be subjects of Athens or even to join her confederacy. The devastation of their land not procuring their submission, the fleet, weighing from Melos, sailed to Oropus in the territory of Graea, and landing at nightfall, the heavy infantry started at once from the ships by land for Tanagra in Boeotia, where they were met by the whole levy from Athens, agreeably to a concerted signal, under the command of Hipponicus, son of Callias, and Eurymedon, son of Thucles. They encamped, and passing that day in ravaging the Tanagraean territory, remained there for the night. And next day, after defeating those of the Tanagraeans who sailed out against them, and some Thebans who had come up to help the Tanagraeans, took some arms, set up a trophy, and retired. The troops to the city, and the others to the ships. Nicias with his 60 ships coasted along shore and ravaged the Locrian seaboard, and so returned home. About this time, the Lacedaemonians founded their colony of Heraclea in Trachis, their object being the following. The Malians form in all 3 tribes, the Paralians, the Hyrrians, and the Trachinians. The last of these, having suffered severely in a war with their neighbors the Otaeans, at first intended to give themselves up to Athens, but afterwards, fearing not to find in her the security that they sought, sent to Lacedaemon, having chosen Tesamenus for their ambassador. In this ambassador join also the Dorians from the mother country of the Lacedaemonians, with the same request, as they themselves also suffered from the same enemy. After hearing them, the Lacedaemonians determined to send out the colony, wishing to assist the Trachinians and Dorians, and also because they thought that the proposed town would lie conveniently for the purposes of the war against the Athenians. A fleet might be got ready there against Euboea, with the advantage of a short passage to the island, and the town would also be useful as a station on the road to Taos. In short, everything made the Lacedaemonians eager to found the place. After first consulting the god at Delphi and receiving a favorable answer, they sent off the colonists, Spartans and Perioece, inviting also any of the rest of the Hellenes who might wish to accompany them, except Ionians, Achaeans, and certain other nationalities. 3 Lacedaemonians leading as founders of the colony, Leon, Alcidas, and Damagon. The settlement effected, they fortified anew the city, now called Heraclea, distant about 4 miles and a half from Thermopylae and 2 miles and a quarter from the sea, and commenced building docks, closing the side towards Thermopylae just by the pass itself, in order that they might be easily defended. The founding of this town, evidently meant to annoy Euboea, the passage across to Cannaeum in that island being a short one, at first caused some alarm at Athens, which the event, however, did nothing to justify, the town never giving them any trouble. The reason of this was as follows. The Thessalonians, who were sovereign in those parts, and whose territory was menaced by its foundation, were afraid that it might prove a very powerful neighbor, and accordingly continually harassed and made war upon them, until they at last wore them out, in spite of their originally considerable numbers, people flocking from all quarters to a place founded by the Lacedaemonians, and thus thought secure of prosperity. On the other hand, the Lacedaemonians themselves, in the persons of their governors, did their full share towards ruining its prosperity and reducing its population, as they frightened away the greater part of the inhabitants by governing harshly and in some cases not fairly, and thus made it easier for their neighbors to prevail against them. The same summer, about the same time that the Athenians were detained at Melos, their fellow citizens in the 30 ships cruising around Peloponnese, after cutting off some guards in an ambush at Elomenis in Leucadia, subsequently went against Leucas itself with a large armament, having been reinforced by the whole levy of the Acarnanians, except Oeniadae, and by the Sacanthenians and Cephallenians and 15 ships from Corcyra. While the Leucadians witnessed the devastation of their land without and within the isthmus upon which the town of Leucas and the temple of Apollo stand, without making any movement on account of the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, the Acarnanians urged Demosthenes, the Athenian general, to build a wall so as to cut off the town from the continent, a measure which they were convinced would secure its capture and rid them once and for all of a most troublesome enemy. Demosthenes, however, had in the meanwhile been persuaded by the Messenians that it was a fine opportunity for him, having so large an army assembled, to attack the Aetolians, who were not only the enemies of Naupactus, but whose reduction would further make it easy to gain the rest of that part of the continent for the Athenians. The Aetolian nation, although numerous and warlike, yet dwelt in unwalled villages scattered far apart, and had nothing but light armor, and might, according to the Messenians, Peloponnese be subdued without much difficulty before succors could arrive. The plan which they recommended was to attack first the Apodotians, next the Ophionians, and after these the Eurytanians, who are the largest tribe in Aetolia and speak, as is said, a language exceedingly difficult to understand, and eat their flesh raw. These once subdued, the rest would easily come in. To this plan Demosthenes consented, not only to please the Messenians, but also in the belief that by adding the Aetolias to his other continental allies, he would be able, without aid from home, to march against the Boeotians by way of Ozolian Locris to Citinium in Doris, keeping Parnassus on his right until he descended to the Phocians, whom he could force to join him if their ancient friendship for Athens did not, as he anticipated, at once decide them to do so. Arrived in Phocis, he was already upon the frontier of Boeotia. He accordingly weighed from Leucas against the wish of the Acarnanians, and with his whole armament sailed along the coast to Salium, where he communicated to them his intention, and upon their refusal to agree to it on account of the non-investment of Leucas. The roads, however, were already occupied, and while the Amphilochians knew their own country, the Ambraciots were ignorant of it, and could not tell which way to turn, and had also heavy armor as against a light-armed enemy, and so fell into ravines, and into the ambushes which had been set for them, and perished there. In their manifold efforts to escape, some even turned to the sea, which was not far off, and seeing the Athenian ships coasting along shore just while the action was going on, swam off to them, thinking it better in the panic they were in, to perish, if perish they must, by the hands of the Athenians, than by those of the barbarous and detested Amphilochians. Of the large Ambraciot force destroyed in this manner, a few only reached the city in safety, while the Acarnanians, after stripping the dead and setting up a trophy, returned to Argos. The next day arrived a herald from the Ambraciots, who had fled from Olpae to the Agrians, to ask leave to take up the dead that had fallen after the first engagement, when they left the camp with the Mantineans and their companions, without, like them, having had permission to do so. At the sight of the arms of the Ambraciots from the city, the herald was astonished at their number, knowing nothing of the disaster, and fancying that they were those of their own party. Someone asked him what he was so astonished at, and how many of them had been killed, fancying in his term that this was the herald from the troops at Idomene. He replied, "About 200, upon which his interlocutor took him up, saying, "Why, the arms you see here are of more than 1,000. The herald replied, "Then they are not the arms of those who fought with us?" The other answered, "Yes, they are, if at least you fought at Idomene yesterday. But we fought with no one yesterday, but the day before in the retreat. However that may be, we fought yesterday with those who came to reinforce you from the city of the Ambraciots." When the herald heard this and knew that the reinforcement from the city had been destroyed, he broke into wailing, and, stunned at the magnitude of the present evils, went away at once without having performed his errand, or again asking for the dead bodies. Indeed, this was by far the greatest disaster that befell any one Hellenic city in an equal number of days during this war. And I have not set down the number of the dead, because the amount stated seems so out of proportion to the size of the city as to be incredible. In any case, I know that if the Acarmenians and Amphilochians had wished to take Ambracia as the Athenians and Demosthenes advised, they would have done so without a blow. As it was, they feared that if the Athenians had it, they would be worse neighbors to them than the present. After this, the Acarnanians allotted a third of the spoils to the Athenians, and divided the rest among their own different towns. The share of the Athenians was captured on the voyage home. The arms now deposited in the Attic temples are 300 panoplies, which the Acarnanians set apart for Demosthenes, and which he brought to Athens in person, his return to his country after the Aetolian disaster being rendered less hazardous by this exploit. The Athenians in the 20 ships also went off to Naupactus. The Acarnanians and Amphilochians, after the departure of Demosthenes and the Athenians, granted the Ambraciots and Peloponnesians, who had taken refuge with Salynthius and the Agrians, a free retreat from Oniade, to which place they had removed from the country of Salynthius, and for the future concluded with the Ambraciots a treaty and alliance for 100 years, upon the terms following. It was to be a defensive, not an offensive alliance. The Ambraciots could not be required to march with the Acarnanians against the Peloponnesians, nor the Acarnanians with the Ambraciots against the Athenians. For the rest, the Ambraciots were to give up the places and hostages that they held of the Amphilochians, and not to give help to Anactorium, which was at enmity with the Acarnanians. With this arrangement, they put an end to the war. After this, the Corinthians sent a garrison of their own citizens to Ambracia, composed of 300 heavy infantry under the command of Xenoclides, son of Euthyclides, who reached their destination after a difficult journey across the continent. Such was the history of the affair of Ambracia. The same winter, the Athenians in Sicily made a descent from their ships upon the territory of Himera, in concert with the Sicels, who had invaded its borders from the interior, and also sailed to the islands of Aeolus. Upon their return to Rhegium, they found the Athenian general Pythodorus, son of Isolocus, come to supersede Laches in the command of the fleet. The allies in Sicily had sailed to Athens and induced the Athenians to send out more vessels to their assistance, pointing out that the Syracusans, who already commanded their land, were making efforts to get together a navy to avoid being any longer excluded from the sea by a few vessels. The Athenians proceeded to man 40 ships to send to them, thinking that the war in Sicily would thus be the sooner ended, and also wishing to exercise their navy. One of the generals, Pythodorus, was accordingly sent out with a few ships, Sophocles, son of Sostratides, and Eurymedon, son of Teuclus, being destined to follow with the main body. Meanwhile, Pythodorus had taken the command of Laches' ships, and towards the end of winter sailed against the Locrian fort which Laches had formerly taken, and returned after being defeated in battle by the Locrians. In the first days of this spring, the stream of fire issued from Etna, as on former occasions, and destroyed some land of the Catanians, who live upon Mount Etna, which is the largest mountain in Sicily. 50 years, it is said, had elapsed since the last eruption, there having been 3 in all since the Hellenes have inhabited Sicily. Such were the events of this winter, and with it ended the 6th year of this war, of which Thucydides was the historian. Book 4.